You stand at the window of the farmhouse, November cold pressing against the glass, and watch the dark shapes coalesce on the horizon. The approach of an army is always terrifying, but why are these dark shapes on the horizon the real horror of American history? The column of men is loose, disordered, moving with the predatory efficiency of a force untethered from command. You count them, 12, perhaps 15, and the counting provides a fragile illusion of control that the rising smoke instantly destroys. That smoke, dark and oily, comes from the direction of the Hartwell farm, miles away, confirming the true purpose of their arrival. The war, which was supposed to be fought elsewhere, has come for you, walking across your fields with torches and an empty cart, forcing you to choose between flight, invisibility, or the dangerous pretense of civilized cooperation. When you realize how the hard hand of war strips away everything but survival. The system that birthed these men was called total war, a strategy articulated by General William T. Sherman to break the will of the Southern populace. But what if everything you knew about Sherman's march to the sea was the official lie? It was a campaign designed not just to defeat armies, but to dismantle the very infrastructure of civilian morale, ensuring that old and young, rich and poor felt the hard hand of war. But the hand that fell hardest rarely struck the Confederate leadership. It fell upon isolated women and children left on farms that lay directly in the Army's 60-mile-wide path of destruction. Because when the able-bodied men had departed for the front, they left behind a vacuum of protection that the foraging parties were specifically designed to exploit. The official military orders prohibited violence against civilians, but these orders were written on thin paper and enforced by men who were miles away, focused only on logistics, revealing how command absence created the perfect cover for historical violations. Imagine the knock that confirms your deepest fear has arrived, and it is wearing a uniform. Because you remember the whispers, the stories shared in hushed tones over quilting frames. The truth the intercepted letters dared not carry. You recall the tale of the Thornton farm in Jasper County, where the foraging party stayed for 3 days, and the newspapers called it requisitioning, but the surviving women called it something else. Something that left Mrs. Thornton sitting by her window, watching the empty road, unable to speak her own name. The soldiers are closer now, young faces hardened by conflict, laughing about some distant, unremarkable thing, and one points directly at your house, making you realize that your time is measured in minutes, a shrinking metric of survival. With the unloaded hunting rifle in the closet, serving only as a cruel symbol of useless protection. The minutes tick down, and you must choose between flight, invisibility, or the dangerous pretense of civilized cooperation when you realize how little your life matters to the approaching force. The narrative of Sherman's march, long accepted, emphasized material destruction, barns burned, railroads torn up, the economic capacity of the Confederacy dismantled. But why did historians systematically erase the most human cost of this conflict? This version of history, however accurate in its details of property loss, systematically omitted the human dimension of the conflict, the collateral devastation that could not be measured in bushels of corn or lengths of twisted rail, because historians relied on military reports, which framed the operation as orderly and disciplined, while actively suppressing the fragmentary evidence left in civilian diaries and private soldiers' letters. The system's refusal to prosecute crimes against persons was the very mechanism that ensured the crimes would not appear in the historical record for over a century, allowing a comfortable version of history to obscure the brutal truth of the march. What you are about to attempt is a transaction of survival, but you already know the currency you are offering is insufficient, because the man who reaches your fence line is older than the rest, wearing the marks of authority, though perhaps not the morality. He is Sergeant William Carnes, a veteran whose bearing suggests violence has earned him more recognition than regulation, and you see the look on his face, an expression that registers not recognition of a person, but simple appraisal of prey. You meet him at the door, your hands empty, your posture an attempt to convey submission without vulnerability. But the transaction fails immediately. The air changes the moment Carnes pushes the door open with his boot, his rifle held casually low as his eyes sweep the room, categorizing, assessing. How many others in the house? His voice is procedural, practiced, but your answer, I'm alone, confirms his arithmetic. The men are gone, the women are here, which is why he announces the purpose. Requisitioning supplies, food, livestock, anything of military value. You offer the inventory immediately. Corn in the smokehouse, preserved vegetables, the pig, the chickens, and you watch the men spread out, moving with practiced speed toward the outbuildings. Their movements, a choreography of plunder developed through repetition on countless other isolated farms. They take the silver candlesticks, the quilts, the small cache of Confederate currency hidden beneath the floorboards, stripping the house of all material value. But this is only the beginning of what they truly want. An hour passes, marked by the squeal of the pig being dragged out and the casual, sickening snap of chickens' necks, and you wonder what remains when they leave, as the column of smoke from the Hartwell farm has faded to a thin gray wisp against the darkening November sky. Carnes returns to the main room. The cart is loaded, the outbuildings are stripped, and the mission is officially accomplished. So you expect him to give the order to leave, to move on, but he does not. And the sudden silence when the mission is complete is the most terrifying sound of all. The silence that fell was not the silence of departure, but the heavy, charged quiet of men waiting for a different kind of transaction to begin, revealing the dark purpose explicitly forbidden, but implicitly enabled by the strategy of total war. Carnes looks at you and his expression shifts, moving into a territory that official orders explicitly forbade, but implicitly enabled. And he speaks. And the words, deceptively simple, shatter the brittle cooperation you had maintained. The boys have been marching hard. They could use some rest before we move on. The temperature in the room drops. The three men who remained inside shift their weight, their bored gazes sharpening into something alert and focused. And you realize the transaction has failed. They have everything, but they want one more thing that cannot be loaded onto the cart. This moment is the rupture, the fundamental discontinuity that divides your life into the before and the after. But why did the military hierarchy guarantee this violation would happen? You have already rehearsed this scenario, imagined the worst possibilities, but the reality is colder, more procedural than any nightmare. And you speak, your voice surprisingly steady, though fueled by adrenaline. There's nothing more to take. You have everything. Carnes smiles, a flat, unpleasant expression that holds no mercy. Not everything, he confirms, because the foraging parties, poorly supervised and frequently operating miles from any commanding officer, understood the implicit message. The spoils of war included whatever the isolated territory yielded. The formal military structure provided the initial access. The deliberate lack of supervision provided the impunity. The documentation of what came next exists only in fragments, buried deep within restricted archives and hidden family Bibles, proving that these were not isolated incidents, but an unwritten policy guaranteed by command absence. Which is why Private Edward Cutter of the 103rd Illinois wrote home, "The boys take what they want, and the officers don't ask questions. I have seen things on this march that I will not write about, because you would not believe them." Sergeant James McDermott confided in his diary, "Visited a farm today where only women remained. The men had their way with them, and I could not stop it." These rare admissions confirm the systematic nature of the violation, not isolated incidents, but an unwritten policy enabled by deliberate command absence, because the Provost Marshal's office recorded only 17 courts-martial for crimes against civilians during the entire march, and only 2 involved violence against persons resulting in minimal punishment. Dolly Sumner Lunt Burge, a plantation mistress whose farm was visited by the soldiers, recorded the material losses in agonizing detail. But why did she reserve the central trauma for a single coded line that was later censored? "To my chamber they rush, and there do I pass the longest night of my life." That line, later excised by nervous editors, contained the unspoken truth understood by every woman who survived the path of the army. And when Carnes finally moves toward you, unhurried, his expression devoid of recognition or remorse, you understand the code. He stops 2 feet away, the smell of whiskey and violence radiating from him, confirming that the war is not a distant policy, but a physical violation that consumes the individual. You want to speak, to explain that you never owned slaves, that your husband was a reluctant conscript in a war that was never yours. But why does the explanation not matter to the man reaching for you? You understand that you are no longer a person to him, but a symbol, a representative of the enemy populace that must be made to feel the hard hand of war. Carnes reaches for you, and your consciousness begins the slow, necessary retreat from your body, because the first soldier finishes at approximately 9:30, leaving you in the wreckage of the bedroom. You have entered a continuous present, a landscape of sensation where precision is impossible and time has ceased to be tracked. The continuation of the violence throughout the night was facilitated by the knowledge that no authority would intervene, no consequences would follow, because the bummers, unofficial raiders, deserters, and opportunists who followed the army operated with even greater impunity than the official foraging parties, demonstrating that the collapse of law was comprehensive. Private Rice Bowl, a Union soldier, described encountering these groups. They had women's jewelry pinned to their coats and blood on their hands that they made no effort to wash. The sheer vacuum of consequence created by the army's rapid movement and focus on destruction was the primary weapon against the women left behind, proving that their only defense was silence, their only recourse, private forgetting. The psychological mechanism of detachment, the creation of a refuge outside the physical self, is the brain's final defense against the unbearable. But why does the body involuntarily choose survival over peace? You stop tracking the men. Their faces become indistinguishable, their actions blurring into a continuous, numbing event, and you think of Daniel, but only as an abstract concept, a warm memory from the world that existed before 500 p.m. You consider dying, the thought arriving with calm administrative simplicity. Death would stop this, but the body, determined, refuses to comply with the conscious wish, choosing survival over peace. This choice, this involuntary biological imperative, will be the foundation of the decades of silence that follow, ensuring the trauma is buried deep. Gray light begins to filter through the bedroom window, marking the inevitable return of morning and the end of the longest night. And Sergeant Carnes enters one final time. He looks at you with an expression that contains not remorse, but a pragmatic recognition that what has happened requires forgetting, on his part and yours, as he confirms, "We're moving out. Don't try to follow us. Don't try to report this. There's no one to report to." His words are the final confirmation of the system's complicity. The absence of protection equals the absence of justice, leaving you with the silence which settles over the farmhouse like snowfall, heavy and profound. You wait 3 hours before you move, because the flexing of your toes is the first sign of reclamation, a small signal sent through a body you must slowly reoccupy. You rise, the effort monumental, and walk through the main room toward the front door, where the November air outside is cold and clean, tasting of a world that has not been contaminated. You survey the damage, the empty smokehouse, the broken fences, the scatter of feathers where the chicken coop once stood, and everything of material value is gone. But the house still stands, the fields still exist, and the necessity of continuing life imposes itself, demanding a decision about how you will reconstruct your reality. The decision you must make is not immediate, but it begins to form in the cold, silent air of that morning, as you realize that, to survive, you must construct a narrative, an official history that acknowledges the destruction while burying the violation. But what is the full cost of this chosen silence? When Daniel returns, you will tell him about the requisitioning, the stolen property, the loss of livestock. You will not tell him about the night, because You will not allow the soldiers' cruelty to extend beyond your body to poison the fragile relationship they might still rebuild. The women who survived understood the high social cost of acknowledgement in the 19th century, because to report what happened, even if a mechanism for justice had existed, was to invite ostracism, to destroy one's reputation, and to risk the collapse of a marriage that relied on Victorian concepts of female honor. The period term ruined placed responsibility squarely on the victim, meaning to speak was to confess to damage. Silence was the only viable path to functional survival, becoming an unwritten contract of protection. Margaret Eberhardt's diary, found hidden in a false compartment over a century later, provides a chilling corroboration of this strategic silence, revealing why collective forgetting became the foundation of how the march was remembered. After describing the visitation, she concluded, "We have agreed not to speak of this, not to each other, not to anyone. When the war ends and life resumes, we will say the soldiers took our property. That is all we will say. This is the only way to continue living." This collective cooperative forgetting became the foundation of how the march was remembered, ensuring that the economic loss was acknowledged, but the human cost was systematically excluded because the truth was preserved in private silence. The lie was consecrated in public history. When Daniel Edmondson finally arrived home in May 1865, exhausted and thin, he saw the physical damage and understood the material loss, because he had expected it. Everyone had heard the rumors of destruction. "They took everything," Sarah told him, pointing to the empty barn. "The food, the animals, everything we had." Daniel, relieved to be home and eager to resume life, accepted this account, saying, "Well, rebuild. We're alive. That's what matters." He did not ask about the flinching when he touched her unexpectedly, or the way she sometimes stared blankly at the road, because he knew that sometimes survival requires the deliberate choice not to know, allowing the lie to persist. The construction of the official narrative relied on this mutual silence, where historians focused on Sherman's own memoirs, which expertly framed the march as a strategic triumph and economic warfare, while omitting the specifics of civilian conduct. The omission was strategic. Sherman was a skilled writer who knew exactly what his army had done, and he chose to write around that knowledge so his narrative, unchallenged by inaccessible women's accounts and buried soldiers' letters, became the settled version. This is how historical erasure operates, not through a grand conspiracy, but through the accumulated weight of individual decisions to look away, preserving the comfort of the historical record. Even the perpetrators struggled with the silence, because Private Thomas Mitchell, a Union soldier, wrote a desperate letter home asking his sister to burn it immediately after reading. But why did his confession become a hidden clue to the system's culpability? He confessed to witnessing and participating in the violations, admitting, "I had a choice. I chose wrong. I chose what was easy over what was right. I cannot undo what I did. I can only tell you so that someone knows." His sister Martha did not burn the letter, but hid it in a Bible, preserving a sliver of the truth that revealed the soldiers knew their acts were wrong, but felt insulated by a system designed to enable rather than prevent consequences. Mitchell's subsequent life of soldier's heart, nightmares, and anxiety was the silent consequence of a system that permitted him to choose wrong. Sarah Edmondson lived until 1908, carrying the knowledge alone for 43 years. But what are the silent generational costs of burying such a profound trauma? She rebuilt the farm, raised 3 children, and maintained a public facade of recovery. Yet, the trauma left its indelible residue, the inexplicable silences, the checking of the road, the deep, abiding sense of being somewhere else that her granddaughter would later describe. Her secret died with her, or seemed to die, becoming a generational ghost, a pattern of behavior with no articulated cause, meaning the silence meant to protect the marriage instead became an inherited wound that the family accommodated without understanding its source. The patterns of violation, the use of sexual violence as psychological warfare, and the systematic erasure by command structures are tragically timeless. asking us if we truly understand how American history reflects global war crimes. From Sherman's march to the conflicts in Bosnia, Rwanda, and Syria, the historical truth is constant. Where the rule of law collapses, the civilian body becomes a battleground. And while international law now recognizes such acts as war crimes, the American acknowledgement of its own past remains incomplete. Understanding this history is not about assigning modern guilt. It is about recognizing that comfortable national narratives are often built upon the erasure of victims whose suffering does not fit the myth. In 2019, Sarah Edmondson's great-granddaughter, tracing genealogy, found a letter from a neighbor written in 1866. But how did this single discovery break the 150-year silence and force a reckoning? It spoke of poor Sarah Edmondson, who has not been the same since the soldiers came through, and concluded, everyone knows what happened to women on those farms, but no one speaks of it. This small thread of evidence finally connected the family's inexplicable silence to the historical horror of the march, and the family's subsequent choice was critical to continue the inherited erasure or to choose acknowledgement. They chose recognition, finally affirming that a woman who suffered deserves to have her experience validated, even 150 years too late. This video is created for educational and historical purposes, examining themes of power, corruption, and human conflict without depicting explicit or graphic events, ensuring the focus remains on the historical suppression of truth. The November afternoon fades toward evening as the soldiers approach Sarah's farmhouse for the first time, and she is standing at the window, not knowing the specifics of her fate, but sensing the chasm opening beneath her feet, the definitive moment that will divide her life forever. She makes her decision. She will not run. She will stand, offer cooperation, and hope that dignity might serve as an inadequate shield, because she is alone, standing in the path of an army that answers to no one for what it does to women like her. This happened not to a character, but to thousands of women whose suffering was systematically buried by silence, serving to protect the comfort of the historical record, ensuring their trauma became a hidden history. You know about the foraging parties, the unwritten policy, the absent courts-martial, and the silence that lasted 150 years. So, if this story made you reflect on fragility of power, stay with us for the next chapter of this hidden history. If this unsettled you, you're not alone. Walk further into history's shadows with us to confront the secrets the victors tried to bury.